Welcome back to Carbon Trust Route to Net Zero Africa. Next, we're going to hear about how responsible finance can help investors and corporates to do more to focus on the issues for Africans in solving their funding needs sustainably, and to tell us what it would take to unlock long-term retirement savings to fund climate change in Africa. And Cabot-Alletzhauser is in the studio from the Responsible Finance Initiative to tell us more.
Hi, I'm Ann Cabot-Alletzhauser, and I'm the practice director of a new initiative called the Responsible Finance Initiative that's been set up by the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And the focus of the initiative is effectively how do we get long-term assets to do much more? How do we get investing to really focus on the issues for Africa and South Africans and solving their funding needs? I've been asked by the organizers of this conference to sort of introduce the South African perspective by being pretty controversial, and that's easy to do, and something I've always been happy to do. But I didn't have to do it this time. I think Mark Carney really started the ball rolling when he got up and he kind of announced after COP26 that there was $150 trillion in assets waiting to commit to the whole climate change initiative. And, we all kind of sat back and gasped, and I think Larry Fink sort of summed it up saying, it's one thing to say there are people that represent 150 trillion in assets, which is probably 40% of the assets available in the globe, that say, yes, we're committed to climate change. It's another thing to actually deploy those assets into the challenge. And that's really what I want to focus on. And so what I've called in my provocative way, the title of what I want to talk about, it's Time to Grow Up. And Time to Grow Up is really all about how realistic is it to get these long-term savings to fund change, and what will it take to get this to happen? So let me try to contextualize this. Last week, I had to speak to a conference, the Institute of Retirement Funds for South Africa. And I had in front of me a room filled with people looking like deer caught in headlights. These were trustees who were asking the question, what is actually being asked of me now? I'm being bombarded. Is it climate change? Is it gender equality? Is it biodiversity? Is it transformation? Is it unemployment? And how on earth do I mesh this into what I'm already being asked to do, which is effectively, how do I solve for retirement funds members in terms of the lump savings that they need to acquire so that they can fund 20 years of unemployment income that will keep them afloat after they've left their corporations. So the first thing I tried to make clear is you're not in this alone. You don't have to solve all these problems. We're working with a massive global movement of asset managers, universal asset owners, banks, private sector, government, development banks. You're just one part of the equation. So if you can begin to understand everybody else's role, at least we have a starting point here that we can work with. But the second point is, we now are flooding these people with this, what I would call the alphabet soup of initiatives to add to the confusion. I don't call it that. Someone else called it the alphabet on acid, but the number of acronyms that were being thrown out also added to the confusion, because what were they addressing? What were they trying to solve? Because as fiduciaries, what do we care about? Well, here is the South African context. We're kind of a market leader in the conversion of defined benefit funds to defined contribution funds. We've been doing it for over 20 years. Now, why is this important to understand? Because these are funds where the member takes all the risk. There isn't a pension. These should be called retirement funds. They're simply savings for retirement. So if you're a fiduciary responsible for these assets, what do you care most about? Well, you care about the fact that there's got to be money that has to be paid out in an instant to members. In other words, liquidity is a primary issue. The other thing you have responsibility for is to try to meet the member expectations of that income replacement after employment. But they're being flooded by all these different initiatives that are really focusing on the metrics or reporting, what is it going to take? How do we target? How do we solve climate change? And those are two very, very different problems that you're asking trustees to address. So how have we done it historically in South Africa? It's not so different from defined contribution funds elsewhere. You start with the actuary determining your strategic asset mix to meet the long-term funding requirements. In this country, we typically use CPI plus 5%. We assign managers to manage these different asset class benchmarks. We kind of de-risk the member as they get near retirement. And then we measure performance, and this is very important, on the basis of whether they outperform the benchmark asset mix that represents the CPI plus 5%. So we could easily go to members and say, let's rethink the problem in this context of where we're trying to put social and environmental imperatives into the equation. And we can say to them, and we can probably give them a fairly compelling story, that if we could use these long-term savings to improve the quality of the world that you're going to retire into or you're going to be unemployed in, and those assets could be used to develop issues such as things that are relevant to you, like the quality of health, the quality of education, affordable housing, inequality, then irrespective of the inflation target, this should give them some comfort that it's going to reduce their cost of living in retirement. You notice I haven't used the word climate change yet, because that's a very, very different sell. And that's a very complicated sell, because right now you use the word climate change and people think the word unemployment. And they think, how do we manage the fact that if I'm trying to solve for climate change, that I will end up in an industry, in a country where mining is such an important part of the social fabric here in terms of providing health, education, housing, all of these sort of good things. What's going to happen if these sort of targets are cut back for us? But the important thing that I think we've got to keep in mind is that now we're asking asset managers to do something they've never done before. Before, all they were doing is income protection post-retirement. Now we're asking them to look at societal needs. So it's also about creating that viable future. And there's no question climate change is part of the equation, but understand the importance of the cell. And understand that the fact that you're working in a DC environment, and you're working in a DC environment where, very importantly, unlike Europe and other parts of the world, you don't have a regulator who is sitting there saying you absolutely have to keep your savings in the scheme. You can take it out the minute you cease employment anytime you want, or you change jobs, you take your money out. So there's no mandatory preservation that goes on here. You're also in a regulatory environment where there aren't the big industry initiatives that are aligned to the financial initiatives. So there's not this sort of meeting of the minds between what the industry has to achieve and what the finance has to achieve. So the way we talked to this group of trustees is that we said, do you even understand how to get, I don't, obviously didn't phrase it like that, but how do you get your money to work for you? And this was a really surprising reaction from them, because I think a lot of them didn't really quite have grasped the fact that there's certain things that do create change and impact in terms of how they invest, and other things that really are extraneous. They cost lots of money, and there's a lot of effort put into it, but it really doesn't move the dial. And we had to sit there and explain to them that buying and selling listed equities or secondary market assets like government bonds doesn't create change. You're simply passing your money from yourself to another investor. There is no linkage between that money immediately and the company. And that, I think, gave people tremendous pause for thought. I think there's also been a massive focus on proxy voting in South Africa. And we said, you know what? proxy voting is effectively meaningless unless you're absolutely certain you're able to get the key issues onto the agenda. So it's not the proxy voting that's important. It's the active engagement that's important, that gets companies to put the critical issues that you care about onto the agenda. We also had to explain that there was a huge problem with this huge focus on things like ESG scores at portfolio level or aggregate portfolio levels, because these were all backward-looking indicators. And what we didn't have in terms of a score, or what you problematically were looking at in terms of a score, is if you had a high ESG score for your portfolio, that did not necessarily translate into affecting change. You simply have bought the companies that are either pass the problem down further in their supply chain, or basically have already addressed the issue. So you're not really impacting change. And cash and even for us, global didn't count. So the big problem in a country like South Africa, where our capital markets are actually more international than probably anything else, where only 30% of the revenues are generated by South African initiatives, using these listed assets to create change is hugely problematic. So what does create change and impact? And this is what we said to them. You've got to now start focusing on things that most trustees don't. They look at equities. We say you've got to look at the bonds. We say we have to look in the private equity, and not all private equity is equal. We cannot go into the strip and flip model of private equity. We need to focus on the impact projects. Active engagement plus proxy voting. And now we have to really push hard against this huge industry of ESG data providers to say that if we can't translate these into impacting results, all this money and time and energy that you put into creating this stuff is effectively meaningless. So the coalitions also of shareholders become tremendously important in here, particularly when you're trying to drive change and get people to really have that active interaction with the companies. So one of the probably best pieces of work that's been looking at this issue of how do we take a world that really operates in what I would call the conventional modern portfolio theory world. And by modern portfolio theory, I'm saying you start with a funding target, you start with a benchmark that represents that funding target, you look at performance in relation to plus or minus adding above or below that benchmark. That's your alpha in there. And basically that's the model that you're working with. And therefore, because these decisions about weighting are very much driven by market cap weighted indices, what we find is the big issue is when you operate in that world, you're just twiddling around at the edges in terms of impact. You really are doing very, very little. It's market cap weighting that really influences the outcome. And so when you look at basically the way the world is coming together in terms of trying to put together the imperative for climate investing with the way that people typically operate, Houston, we really, really have a problem. And I really encourage you to look at some of these EdHec study discussions, because what they determine is that the outcome of these things is that basically these portfolios that are held in this MPT type of environment, the 93% of the weighting differences between what the new mandate is trying to achieve and what the old mandate is trying to achieve has absolutely nothing to do with trying to address climate change. And in fact, the current regulations or the demand to try to get accountability is pushing the problem even further in this direction, because it's saying, demonstrate, give me a number when you finish investing that says I was able to achieve this carbon footprint or carbon emission reduction or whatever it is you want to be measuring. And those typically are not things that talk about where will it go in the future, but what does it look like in the past? So let's go back to the issue of impact. and recognize that it's limited. It's not about disinvesting, although that's a very, very small stick that active investors can use. And it's all about demonstrating a trajectory that is showing change over time. So if you take a look at the current approaches to ESG and sustainable impact investing and the way that these trustees are being sold, they think it's okay to look at things like on a passive or active basis, just their ESG scores or carbon emission. But we already know that you're often working at a Z score across an entire industry and said, well, we don't know whether or not the entire industry is problematic, but this is the best in that industry. So you're often working off relative scores off of very low base. If we put these things into evaluation considerations or risk considerations, okay, we've made a step in the right direction, but it's still business as usual, and we still are only impacting at the fringes. If we add stewardship and we add engagement, now we're starting to move. But once we move into the real impact space and the systems change, we have a whole new ballgame. We need to change absolutely everything from the metrics to the kinds of investments we make to the whole way the industry operates from top to bottom, not just the asset managers. Now, this problem is finally becoming recognized. And we've got two frameworks or two elements that are out there in the international community, the PAII framework and the NED, look at all these acronyms, the NEDZAA protocol. And these two things work in concert with each other. And I don't expect you to look at this fine print, but basically the framework sets out the investment process and the protocol sets out what the targets need to be met. This is great stuff. This is actually what you need to do. But understand that to make this work, I'm now using a whole new framework in terms of asset classes. I'm using a whole new framework in terms of benchmarks. And the challenge that we have in South Africa is if you use this blue block and ask the question or answer the question that this blue block represents our entire industry, most of our industry is sitting at the bottom part of that blue block in terms of the way they operate. Conventional return-driven benchmarks, risk is considered, variability to that benchmark, and you're primarily investing in the listed space. So the challenge we have is how do we do the business strategy for these asset managers who need to move up the continuum? Because right now there's a massive cost to doing this in terms of the data that you require and which data is relevant, which is not. There's a massive amount of time consumption. And the great fear that I have with this whole problem is that asset managers are going to look at this and their clients are going to look at this and say, we haven't moved the dial. We are still operating in the same sort of fringes that we have. We haven't moved the dial. We cannot justify the massive additional costs that this thing is incurring. And we become derailed. So appreciate that the challenges for South African regulators is really very, very different than the EU. That we run the risk of not connecting reporting requirements to investment realities because we're sort of forced into this reporting regimen. That our insights on how to do this are changing so fast that we entrench a model, a kind of a policy that doesn't recognize that every single day, I as an asset manager wake up and understand how to do this better. So it's an ongoing engagement, and at the Responsible Finance Initiative, we're trying to take on some of these responsibilities for South Africa in terms of taking over CRISA, hopefully, and some of these dynamics. But okay, so the point that I was trying to make is that we are facing a massive cultural shift in how we run assets. It will be worth it if we can do it, but it will take a lot of focus that we haven't really given to the problem to date. So it will take, for example, a reconsideration of the Pension Funds Act. to redefine what the mission is of pension funds. It's not just to meet accumulation targets or to have fund on a 20-year income replacement. It's also to deploy assets to improve quality of life during the journey. It's about members that have to buy into the value add. You can't simply say, I'm going to change you all to focus on climate change if they don't buy into that and they don't see that as a top priority. So you have to tell the narrative in a way that says climate change has X, Y, and Z impact. And right now, we're just battling to find any funds that are prepared to do this other than the defined benefit funds in this country, because liquidity is so much the issue in this country. It means that actuaries are going to have to rethink how to model the new trade-offs in their ALMs. So it's not a question of just risk and return and variability over the long term. It's also risk return impact. And that really is going to change the whole asset allocation decision at both the strategic and the shorter term level. So you've got really the dynamic, if I want to capture the real economy in South Africa, I have to go outside of the listed market. I have to start incorporating the unlisted market, and I have to start mapping that back to what really changes things in South Africa, not just the rest of the world. And that means we need to restate benchmarks. And peer group is just no longer relevant in this equation. We've got to completely retrain asset consultants to think differently about how to guide the decision making. For asset managers, they need to rethink valuations and activisms that are meaningful. So they've got to learn a whole new skill set in here. We've got to create new mandates, and we've got to make sure that we're not using kind of reporting dynamics that are absolutely meaningless in the equation. So it all gets down to how managers are incentivized, and that is also going to be a cultural shock for the industry. But most importantly, we need to get the regulators to understand that they can't just have a knee-jerk reaction to the impetus that's coming out of Europe, that's coming out of the rest of the world about climate change. We need to have a different framework that appreciates that South Africa is different in terms of the way our long-term assets are structured, that this is a dynamic process. And if I can just add this one last point, we really haven't even begun to understand what are the knock-on effects of all of these changes. What are the laws of unintended consequences that this might generate? So we have to move a little bit more slowly, but we can't just play around at the fringes. We need to change the whole culture. And that's pretty much what I wanted to set out today.